Hello everybody, and welcome to Lawdit Solicitors Tear It Down podcast, which is our brand name for these weekly events. And I'm joined today by Rod Hindmarsh, who is the founder and owner of. I'll let you, Rod, introduce yourself.
I enjoyed to see what you can say about me. How to Franchise. We're a franchise company that helps businesses franchise. We've also franchised ourselves, which gives us more of an insight to managing franchisees. So we help companies franchise, and then we help them recruit the franchisees as well.
So, starting from the basics, would you like to explain what a franchise is? So, for those people who aren't aware of the franchise model.
Yeah, and it's surprising, how many people aren't, and some of these people are big company owners. It's just, it's more of it's not necessarily a modern thing because it's been going with Singer hundreds of years, etc. But so basically, the company who are the franchisor being the owners of the franchise concept, license a franchisee to operate under conditions that are agreed, and that's where our contact has been with Lawdit, is that they've helped us draw up the franchise agreements, etc. And they work under a license, a franchise agreement, under a given term, normally about 5 years. And there's an operations manual that governs how it operates.
And so, examples, walk down the high street, what would be the example of large franchises?
So I think the Americans have statistics, something like 6 out of 7 shops in the high street in America are franchised. So you've got the big food, which is obviously where franchising started in most countries. So you've got McDonald's, Starbucks, Costa Coffee, Subways, etc. And you've got lots of small little franchises that could be after school clubs to people repairing cars.
Yeah, I remember losing my mobile phone or dropping. I can't remember what I did to it, but the day before the London Marathon, and to plod around the London Marathon for 26.2 miles, whatever it is, without a phone was a complete nightmare for me. And I didn't realise that the Orange and all the mobile phone companies are all franchised, because I just rang the local Orange shop in Greenwich thinking I could just pick one up on the way round.
Yeah.
But he was like, "It's got nothing to do with us, mate. You bought it from Southampton." And I was screaming, saying, "Well, that can't be right because you're Orange." And he was like, "Well, there's nothing to do with me just because I've got Orange on the front of the shop. You bought it from Orange, So yeah, there's those businesses that you don't or you're not familiar with are franchised, are indeed franchised.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes people feel, that with a franchise that it's run by head office and that's it. Whereas most people like dealing with franchisees is because the owner of the franchises normally work in the business. But yeah, if the supplier is Orange, I mean, we actually did some work with them right at the beginning, helping them find retail stores, etc. When they were quite small. I always remember going to their meetings, and it was before they become as big as what they are now, or EE, who took it over. Is that it was stand-up meetings. And you had no coffee or tea. You just stood up, and it was a 10-minute meeting. You're thinking, I normally have a coffee and a chat for 10 minutes before I start working, etc. But I think the beauty to me of franchising is that, and I think it's why it works. I mean, I've been doing this now over 30 years. Is that you bring in people who are motivated a whole lot differently than if you work for a company. This is my business. So McDonald's have obviously probably the biggest name in franchising, but they still have some of their stores that are operated through their own management, and their franchisees make more profit than their store managers, and they've won awards for training. They've got people that have flipped burgers who are directors of the business, and yet a franchisee is more motivated. And if it's a good relationship between the franchisor and the franchisee, it's such a powerful way of growing the business.
Yeah, we've just recently signed up a couple of clients who have taken on a Subway franchise.
Right.
And he's successfully got, I think, 2 already on the mainland, and then he's just opening a couple others on the Isle of Wight as well. And it is, when you look at the numbers, it is quite an attractive way of running a business. And if I think that top-heavy side to it, the Subways, the Pizza Huts, the McDonald's, you need significant funds in order to launch. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't start a franchise business. So how does one generally go about starting from scratch? If you obviously need some form of capital.
Yeah, but I always think, when you look at McDonald's and you look at Ron Kroc when he went home, and he's seen the concept, and he went back to his wife and said, I'm going to build one of the biggest companies in the world. And he addresses his wife, and she says, but all they do is sell burgers, have a couple of aspirin and go to bed, etc. So it's simple concepts can become big concepts and become big businesses. The fundamentals of a franchise, I mean, the Americans say 90% of companies can be franchised and the other 10% don't know about it yet. That isn't right, but it's not 100% away from the truth. The company has got to be profitable. The business has got to be profitable. That is the most important part of it, and that can be a cleaning business to something even more complicated. But there's got to be enough profit for the franchisee to pay a royalty back to the company that they franchise from and make a good income from it. So that's the first fundamental of looking to franchise a business.
So starting from scratch, you need to have an existing business model in place. So that needs a business. I always explain to people, you have registered rights and unregistered rights. Registered rights being you have a trademark, a patent, or a registered design, and then unregistered rights, your company name, your customer data, your website, your copyrights, and combined, that creates that those 2 combined rights creates your business. And so you need to have an established not necessarily over a number of years, but something which you can hang your hat on and say, this is my business, which you're going to invest in. I'm in Sheffield, and therefore you're going to take your business in Woking along the same models of my registered or unregistered.
Yeah, I mean, you can't franchise an idea. There's got to be something concrete. And again, our recommendation is to use Lawdit to copyright to trademark their business.
Yeah,
it's one of the fundamentals. But and again, we've got franchises that operate internationally, and again, some protection is needed. It gives it more credibility.
Yeah.
I know we've had disagreements in the past that you can't franchise a company that's not trademarked. I still would recommend that they get trademarked, but and I won't go any further than that by seeing your reaction. But it is the franchise has got to be a proven concept.
Yeah.
And as you said, that doesn't need to be hundreds of years, etc. The franchisor has got to understand and select the franchisee that they can get on with. The one thing I found with franchisees and franchisors is it's not always suitable for everyone.
Yeah.
And mostly a franchisor will know that they don't like that person or get on with that person. So it's not an instant surprise that they don't get on in 2 years' time. Going into business with a franchise is like a marriage. And without giving the company away, I had a franchisee not a million miles from Sheffield in Leeds, which was doing terrifically well. Had 60 franchisees in place within 2 to 3 years, near enough the whole country covered, and he took someone on in Portsmouth. And I remember speaking to the guy in Portsmouth and finding him really difficult. That if I had to put my pen back into my pocket because I wanted to stab him with it. He just had that maybe that says something about me. He just had that personality, and I can remember him going up to Leeds and speaking to the franchise, or a couple of weeks later when he had decided to take him on. And then speaking to him a couple of months later where he was having problems. And I said, but I said to you, I thought he was problematic. And he said, yeah, I did. It was just the money. He had the money to do it. And a franchisor has got to have those skills and experience and judgments to say, if I don't get on with that person, don't take them on.
It is a people business, isn't it? It's if you're good with people and you're good at. I mean, ultimately, I often say to people in my industry, in the legal industry, if people ask me to do terms and conditions, and I say to them, well, if you've got a rubbish service or if your product isn't of reasonable quality, the terms aren't going to help you. The terms only will help you and support your business if you run a really good business, and then people start to try and find holes in your business framework, and that's why the terms are important, and any contract's important. But if you aren't very good with people, then unless you have someone who's in front of house dealing with customers, you're not going to run a successful hotel if you're Basil Fawlty, are you? Really?
No. I think you make such a valid point that sometimes people feel that they can sell a franchise just by the idea and that they've been successful. They've got to be prepared or bring someone in prepared to help them manage that business. And there's 2 points that are quite important to make. One is, if you wouldn't employ that person as a franchisee, as a manager or director within your business and pay them a good salary, then you shouldn't appoint them as a franchisee. It is so fundamental that they are of quality, and and that the franchisee has got to be an asset, an ambassador to the business, and also prepared to follow.
I think that's a very good point, isn't it? If you wouldn't employ that person in your own organization, why would you let them, even though they're 200-300 miles away, why would you allow them to carry out operating a similar venture that you want to be successful?
And the other point is that someone told me right at the beginning, and every day that you sell a franchise, it should come back into your thought. You're taking their life savings. You're taking their dreams. That if you have a responsibility. The franchise agreement can protect you to a certain element, but that your moral compass should be able to say, look, this is a way, and it's a brilliant way of growing a business. This is a way of growing your management, but you've got to be careful that you take on the right candidate.
And what protection does that give me if you mention the agreement? Let's say that I've got a reasonably successful franchise business, and someone north and south. If you just take, use Portsmouth, I run a successful window cleaner business in Portsmouth using, super powered machines. Got a good brand, Clino. We'll call it Clino Portsmouth. And Sheffield, using Sheffield again. Clino wants to come along and do it in Sheffield. What does Clino have to adhere to in order for Portsmouth to allow that? Is it identical almost?
Yeah, I mean, they're like, you shouldn't really see a brand difference. The brand, the point I always say to a franchisor and a franchisee is that you're working under a license. The operations manual helps cement that license with all the little nuances that you need. But you're
And let me
working.
just stop you on that. Sorry, on that operations manual, that would cover your uniforms, delivery, your brochures, your manual, all that type of package that the Sheffield business would get
Yeah.
at the website. And would you get assistance from the franchisor in doing and setting that up, or would he have to come? How does it work? How would Sheffield then start this business?
So the norm is that you would come to the franchisor, he would or she would, and when I first started, all our clients were male. Now over half our clients are female, so make of that, maybe that we're such magnets that we attract the female sex, etc., or male sex, but I don't think that's the case. But
That's just definitely not the case. Trust me.
I was going to say, cruel to be kind. But so the franchisee comes to the franchisor, and they are trained and instructed how to operate. You mentioned windows. Normally, the big thing now is, or the big thing for the last 25 years has been the water and clean water or positive water. And sometimes the manufacturer will do some of the training for you, but it's all under the guidance of rules and regulations that are normally contained within that franchise agreement or the operations manual, which is part of the franchise.
Right, and so you would have to adhere, and that would be spread over what period of time? A year, 5 years, 10 years?
To be honest, it depends. I mean, normally, if you look again as the window clean, that's normally a 5 to 10 day training, and then there's regular updates with the franchisor and the franchisee speaking. They should be speaking, especially at the beginning, weekly, if not daily, just to get an idea and to give to make sure that it's all running smoothly. And that may then go to 2 weeks and monthly. And we would always recommend to a franchisor that you're meeting at least once or twice every quarter to go through. I mean, the beauty of modern technology, you mentioned your phone, is that what I love now is that 30 years ago you had a problem, you would have to go all the distance to sort it out, whereas now you can pick up your phone, you can put it onto FaceTime, and you can show them what that issue is. So
Right, yeah.
so the franchisor has got to have the mechanism there to help sort that out, because the more you manage a franchise, the less time it's going to take. So the beauty of why McDonald's and Subways have done so great is that there's nothing left to chance. The beauty of also McDonald's and Subways is that you've got franchisees that are buying multiple franchises. You've already gave the example yourself, because the franchisor has made the process straightforward, simple, and answering the question. So a franchisor has to understand that it's not just that short-term profit which a lot of them see. It's actually growing a brand and growing the business.
So there are two questions from that. How long would the franchise agreement normally be in place for? And secondly, what assistance does a franchisor give financially? Does it give anything financially apart from time, but actually harder? Will it invest in the franchisee, or is it simply this is the pack that you must follow follow it and you'll see a return, and we don't give you any other than support and advice.
The norm on the franchise agreement is 5 years. Again, we would go to Lawdit and ask advice ourselves if we had a franchisor that wanted something less or more. But that's the norm. You've got the banks that will help and will form relationships with the franchisor. We prefer to work with brokers because they seem to get better deals and be more, the days of when we started in business. I'm putting you in my age bracket, maybe you're younger, but the bank manager used to be someone that everyone knew, and you would. Now it's we all know the problems there. So we prefer to use a broker that seems to be more hands on.
Do you find that works? Because I've had a lot of problems over the last couple of years with relationships and finding and having stories about clients who can't get hold of a bank manager. I remember back in the day, the wonderful Mr. Watson from our bank, who's long retired now, but just, I saw him weekly, a good pal, a good friend, any problems whatsoever, he was on hand, and now it's just impossible, isn't it?
I think people and some of the people I'm dealing with have never had that experience and don't know how bad compared to what it used to be, franchise. I mean, even with some of the big branches, big banks that I want to name, but I shouldn't name, you would have a relationship even with the franchise director of a big branch, etc. And that tends to be becoming more and more isolated, if at all possible.
I suppose in their defense, nowadays, I think the younger listeners or viewers, especially if you're in your 20s, I think someone said to me the day, which made me laugh, is that when they walked past the bank and saw people in there, they thought they were robbing it because who goes into a bank? Whereas when we were of that age, 30 years ago, it was quite regular to go into the bank.
Yeah, and I can remember a couple of times never being in problems with them, but sometimes coming away thinking I like what they've just said. That's made me think in a different way. And so I think that isolation that you have from that. I mean, at the end of the day, the bank is just a service. And they obviously provide the service that what people want. But I think it has changed. So we tend to use a couple of brokers, etc., that tend to help. The other thing that has been a big help for franchise is the government startup loan.
Okay.
So the government startup loan, which is 25 grand for an individual, up to 25 grand from 500. If there's four of them, they can get up to £100,000. And again, that has been a good way to get finance to a franchisee.
And how would you get that? How would you go about getting that?
Again, for any of your viewers, if they go on to Google, which we all use now, or ChatGPT, and just put government startup loan, it will take them to a website, and it's quite easy. That they're going to need, if it's a franchise agreement, they need to put a business plan, and they need to work out their own personal expenses. And the good thing about that, coming back to that mentoring, which was what we were touching with bank managers, is they do get mentoring with it for the first year.
Oh wow! Well, that's really interesting. See, is that a new thing, or is that something that's been going for a long time?
It's been going a long time, but it's it's not marketed as strongly as you think it should be, etc. I think, and again, it's open to any business that's been going less than 3 years.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's I think investment and advice and support. It's quite difficult running a business. I mean, we've run it. I started in 2000 on my own, 2001 on my own. And you look back and you think of I think we're out of the woods now, but they say the first 5 years is probably the most important. And I think if you're in the service industry, um, it seems to be really hard at the moment, or any type of um, what is it when you offer some type of mm,
It is, I think what I find, that is, and I think it's because of modern technology, and how things have gone. I know we do a lot of our stuff now on Zoom. Is sometimes that isolation that business owners can sometimes find themselves in. That's why I always think, the Small Business Foundation, which we're not part of, is a great organisation for them to be able to monitor and mentor themselves through.
yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
and to be aware of that, that the beauty of business now is that you can run it anywhere. The setup costs can be relatively low, but actually getting some mentoring or some coaching is something that someone once said to me, if you were learning to run a marathon, you wouldn't do it without some coaching.
yeah, yeah,
uh, and getting a good accountant, which has taken us a long time, uh,
yeah.
and a reasonable solicitor, which we've had a while.
That's impossible to find. But I think the accountant point is a really good point, because I often say to new startups that come to me, we've set up 2 or 3 this week actually, and young people who are in the music industry. And I've said, if you start making money, I mean, they've got all these great ideas of group structures, and there's going to be this tax efficient. And I said, look, whoa, whoa, just slow down here. I said, are you making any money yet? And they said, no, 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 we've not started yet. I said, well, just keep it. You're not Richard Branson, so keep it all very simple and get yourself a good accountant immediately. Oh, but we're not making money. So, well, you've got about 18 months before you start filing accounts if you're a limited company. But it's a good idea once you start turning over and making some form of revenue. You get £100, just make sure £25 gets put away every week. And use a good accountant for that, and have a separate bank account, because that's what we see more than often, that many companies start up, and before they know it, at the 18 months, they've got no accountant, they've got no accounts, and they really are on the tail, chasing the tail, trying to sort out the finances.
And the thing, and again, that basic advice that you probably were given by your accountant and bank manager, the £25 rule, is something that I remember being told a number of times. But it's also from a franchising point of view. Sometimes when you speak to uh, business owners, of looking how best to take the income in. And you can't do that without getting your accountant involved to give you some advice, etc.
And that's a good question. What happens if, because I'm very proud of my brand, I'm a franchisor, I'm very proud of a brand, I'm very proud of the last 5 years, and unfortunately, the franchisee, I've got 2 or 3 franchises, and all going very well, but one in particular, who I had great hopes for, has turned out to be a bit of a flop.
Yeah.
Partly their fault, partly circumstances. But to be honest, I'm not in the business of looking after these people for circumstances. I'm very sorry for the situation, but it's running down. I'm getting phone calls, even though I'm 400 miles away. I'm getting phone calls from irate customers saying, "What are you going to do about it?" Back to the orange example of my mobile phone. What protection is there for me on that?
I think again it comes back to how you set it up, and that you've got to set it up also with what are the protection that you do want. What are the rules that you want. Do you want to have some idea on sales, minimum sales figures, but also, if you're getting people that are complaining, it's got to be quite strongly documented of what you want them to do, what things you can put in place to help them do what they're meant to be doing, etc. But also, if they fail, what are the steps that you will take to ratify that, and ask them to leave if that's what the ultimate thing is. But it has to be at the beginning that you put those rules in. The operations manual can again add more detail to these procedures, but ultimately the franchisor has got to protect their brand.
So it will be contained in the contract. I will be able to reclaim the brand if the business that I've franchised turns out to be a disaster in that particular area. I'm not stuck with this person to run me down. I can, albeit I appreciate it could be quite a long-winded process, but I'm still able to reclaim that brand and terminate. I'm not stuck with him for the 5-year period if it turns out to be an unmitigated disaster.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting to know. And the dreaded AI. Have you had any thoughts or any? Has it had an impact on you, or is it going to have an impact on you?
To be honest, it's brilliant. I find, I mean, on doing research, I find, my wife hates it, and I keep coming back saying, I've I've had a franchisor today come back and say, look, I've just had this competitor. Can we have a chat about it? And I was able to put it into the system we've got, and it's come back with a report. It's told me what so I am a lover. I do fear that I am a Luddite by nature, but I do, and I fear this will change work practices, etc. But I think it on a research basis is a brilliant tool.
It is a brilliant tool for research, and you've got to be careful. For anyone listening, you've got to be very careful with it too. Use your experience to back up what you've found. But I found it a good equalizer. If I've got a brother who's a big scientist in the States, and quite remarkably, I thought he'd be a bit of a little bit skeptical, but he said it's quite astonishing that what would have taken 3 weeks is now taking 2 hours. But you can't just accept it. So though we see on a regular basis, we see clients who are quite long-term clients, and if they're listening to this, they'll probably know who they are, but they're very comfortable with telling us what the law is. And now even more so now with AI. And you can always tell AI clients, because they don't change the font, they don't change the bold, they always have the same type of AI response, and you always know. And invariably as well, I think you've got to remember AI gives you what you want to know. So that means if you've got a legal dispute and you say, I've fallen off my ladder painting the window, can I sue him? If he asks you, well, who are you and what is your claim and what do you want? They're going to tailor that response.
Yeah.
To the successful. You've got to be very careful.
I very much agree with that. Is that sometimes that you can someone asks you a question and you can say to AI, I want it critical. I want it in favour of this, and they come back with something that looks quite balanced, and you think, oh my God, it's so good.
Yeah,
and then also, I was doing something for a brochure, and I said I got tired and got it to do something. And this was a new franchise, and fortunately, I do read everything that I put into a brochure, and it said that we had 3 branches. And I'm suddenly looking and researching them, thinking, why did I not know you had 3 branches? And they didn't. It made it up.
Yeah, very much so. And I did a witness statement the other day with a client, of course, by Zoom. And when we tidied it up through AI, he was gay, and he's got 4 children. And he's not, but we didn't even have that conversation. But cheeky chat GBT decided to. Now, if I hadn't read that properly and submitted that with the client's statement of truth, not only have I changed his sexuality, I'll probably be sued and have to close down. So you've really got to be careful. And I think they do it on purpose. I think that whoever's created this is putting these things in there just to just to have the last laugh, you know.
To
So,
do it. I, as you said about your brother, it can just save so much time.
yeah, yeah,
But you've got to understand that whatever, if you're going to give something to a client, and we've got clients that come to us and say, I've got the franchise agreement, I've got chat GT or whatever to draw it up, and sometimes you can look at it and just say, but this is missing.
yeah,
But also, we don't want you to end up, because it's such a shortcut to nowhere. What happens if you have a franchisee in 20 years' time that you have problems with, and this agreement, which is there for protection more than anything else, is weak, and you've saved a couple of £1,000, and now you have a claim for £100,000.
yeah. I mean, I think it's a really good tool. It's like having a couple more members of staff, really,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
who are going to do and if you trust these members of staff and you look at it yourself, you analyze it, you're critical of it. It's very good for research. It's very good for doing documents, and it saves time having to write everything out. Um, but just remember that it doesn't know everything yet. I mean, it may well do in 10 years' time. We're all going to be out of work, really. I'm not sure. I don't know about yourself, but I'm not sure how that's going to work for the benefit of us all, because I can't see how you can sort of see. I've been to San Francisco recently, and it's not unusual at all to see one out of every two cars to be automated, with them without any drivers, you know. And I've had a few bottles and I've got in and I'm chatting away to the driver, and there's no there's no driver, and you can sort of, but it's very normal there. And I
yeah.
guess in another 10 years' time, everything will be automated. So all that industry's lost. All those drivers, all those delivery services, all gone. Where are all these people going to be working? And then
Mm.
sooner or later, they're going to come to lawyers. They're going to come to, businessmen like you. So it's quite hard to see how it can be the benefit of mankind long term.
No, no, but I think the situation that it comes to. I know when I've been doing research, and I've had someone that's been quite new to us, that they try to use it, and the research that I produce is far better because of the knowledge and the questions I can ask it,
Yeah.
and go through it. And I think the beauty from a franchisor trying to find it on the internet and talking to someone experienced like you is that you've got that experience, and you will ask questions outside the remit that you give it, because it's quite remitted. If you turn around and say, I want the answer to this, your experience as a solicitor will say, but actually you've got to look at this bit and this bit, and it won't
Yeah.
necessarily give you that. But it can play chess.
Yeah. Better than me. And also what I noticed the other day, we did some research and I just asked the kids, I said, just make sure those cases exist. They made up cases,
Yeah, 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 yeah,
and people have been suspended in my profession because they've
yeah,
turned up and done a skeleton. They've done a skeleton. That wasn't me. You've done a skeleton argument, and these people have just made up a case.
yeah,
So
yeah,
you've really got and made up quotes. Just because every time I see a quote from ChatGPT, I just go, whoa, 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 whoa.
yeah,
Take out those
yeah,
parentheses, because clearly they've just made that up too. So
yeah,
you've
yeah.
got to
Well,
be very
I,
careful.
I,
But
I think, like with you, I just worry where it's going to take us for mankind, and sometimes I'm just glad that I was born when I was born.
I think
It's
so. I think
yeah,
so. I mean, the government AI chap, who's very Blairite and very bland with his views, but they were, comparing it to the Industrial Revolution and how that had a problem.
yeah,
People would say, but you can see clearly the needed men
yeah,
was
yeah,
all men then to carry out and to put these machines into. But you can't see how that can be comparable now to how these machines are going to be introduced. There'll be people obviously who'll need to keep. If you're in IT and you're a computer nerd. Do you remember as well? Jumping aside, I was thinking the other day, there can be 1980, 77, 82, but about 1984, 85, the computer class, we all used to pick on them,
Yeah.
the nerds,
Yeah. Yeah.
and now look at them. And if only I would have had computer and AI then to be able to say, Michael, one day these people are going to be super smart.
Yeah.
But unless you're in that field, I can't see how it's going to be benefit, the ordinary folk and the young people. I just can't see it. When you go to a hotel in China and Japan, it's all robots serving you. There's not going to be anybody serving you.
Yeah, no. Funny enough, I went to Tokyo just recently, and you checked in by yourself, sort of thing, and you did it through your phone, and you're thinking, yeah, I've got some questions as well,
You'd have to ask ChatGPT.
Yeah, it is. But I've got a very good friend who sells computers that do eye and heart surgery.
Yeah.
Or assist in eye and heart surgery, and you
Yeah,
just
yeah,
think,
yeah.
God, it's. I remember years ago when the internet first came out, and someone at a conference asked me about the web and how that affected franchising, and I can remember making a very flippant and comment saying, but what we used to do was stick an advert in the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, the Guardian sometimes, because they had a business page, and the Sunday Times, and you put the answer machine on it, and it would fill up with inquiries. Now it's all about social media and how AI can chase it all down for you and do everything. And you're thinking it's more complicated, but not if you're a nerd.
Not if you're a nerd. That's the thing. So any children listening, please study hard.
It's yeah, but it's like my son was saying, he's 16, my youngest son, and I was talking about driving soon, and he said, I don't know if I want to learn to drive.
Yeah. And that was the first thing we want. Mine the same.
Yeah.
My sons are 21, 20, and they still can't drive, and they're not interested.
No.
They're in London, so I guess there's no need. But
No.
the first thing we wanted to do was to get a car.
Yeah, yeah. And get your dad to show you how to do it, because you couldn't afford the lessons and that. But it's just with the way business is going. You're thinking in 15 years' time, the franchises that we'll be promoting won't need people to operate them.
I know, and I think some crumbs of comfort. I think things like, probably a bit of silly analogy really, but the way vinyls come back. I'm a lover of records, and that seemed to be dead 10 years ago. But now every city, in Southampton, there's 3 or 4 vinyl shops that are thriving. And they're expensive because they can put the prices and charge what they want. I saw a Pink Floyd vinyl, box standard, for £40, which I don't know if that's expensive now compared to what if you spend in Spotify, yeah. But it's so there will be a demand. I know people who refuse to shop in those machine scan things, and when you're in a supermarket, they like to be dealt with by a human.
Yeah.
And I think, but it's the next. When I say back to those people who say that, I say, well, it's not so much that it's when we're all gone and the young people are born with it.
Yeah,
that's when it's the ones who grow up with it that's just normal for them.
Yeah,
and we can remember before the internet. So once they get rid of us, once they cull us, in 30 years' time we're all cull, and then you've got another 20 years, another 50 years when they're all used to. Then it's over.
I just think that the more personal services will things that we don't think about now will become the normal forms of business. And
I think so.
I know when I first started, one of the first and only interviews I went to was at NatWest, to go on into their banking. And the guy turned around to me and said, I knew I blew the interview, about because it was seen to go into banking was safe. You know,
yeah.
20
Very much
years
so.
later, I'm selling franchises to them.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
he turned around and asked me why I wanted to go into banking. I said, because I think it'd be interesting.
yeah.
And he just looked at me, and I thought, yeah, it's not a great answer, is it?
He
No.
probably thought, "God, I'm not taking this man on. If he thinks this job's going to be interesting, bloody hell, I'm not having a pint with this chap."
I was going to say, having a flowery tie, which I think I was wearing at the time, also just I can remember him looking at me thinking, what have we got? Whereas, so I just think that the industries and the businesses that we don't know about will suddenly become, it's like you hear about, people making pottery and stuff, and hundreds of people and weaving, hundreds of people involved.
Yeah,
Now
yeah,
it's all done by machines. Whereas, you could walk down the high street, which is the big thing that I see at the moment, especially because they don't pay tax, is the fingernails.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
You
yeah.
know,
It's a great little wheeze, isn't it?
and the barbers. Uh,
Yeah,
I have a client. My dad would have been shocked that someone goes every week to have his beard trimmed.
yeah, 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 yeah.
So
Well,
it's
I've got very close to me. I've got clients who are barbers and young people. I mean, we're talking very young. We're talking 18 to 21. They've got into business, very entrepreneurial, good people, and they say it's become for, for young men especially. It's become a place for them. They don't drink, so the idea of when I used to their age, the first thing I'd do every night was go for a pint. It'd just been a very normal thing to have a pint, especially in London when I was training. None of them drink, and they meet to have the haircut, and it's become a really social thing.
yeah. No,
I mean, on the Isle of Wight, there must be. It makes me laugh. There must be more barbershops than people.
yeah, yeah.
It,
No,
it's and again, it is a fascinating, and I think you're right. I think there will be a demand for that human interaction
yeah, yeah,
because until it gets, and we won't see this, we'll be long gone. But until that machinery and there's all that robots can deal with all types of humor, all types of sarcasm, anger, you can just see that man against machine, man winning all the time, trying to communicate because you just have it now. How ridiculous some of these bots are when you're speaking to the bank bot.
yeah,
They
yeah.
can't deal with it. I mean, they can't deal with my accent.
Or
I ask them
sarcasm.
exactly. You
Yeah,
know, and so that's going to be a massive problem, and it's hideous. Those bots on the banks, with those
yeah,
new banks that started from Clearbank, in terms of all the branded banks, Smile and all these app
yeah.
banks. I
Revolt.
mean, absolutely hideous.
Yeah, no, but it's again, it's sounding like grumpy old man. I think, but I remember I was brought up by my grandparents. My grandfather saying that I was living in the space age time. That things like Star Trek were coming true, and you're thinking, I'm now feeling that. But I have the argument because my son is only 16 that he has his hair done every couple of weeks due to my
Yeah, yeah,
wife's
yeah,
allowance that she gives him, etc. You're thinking, it's so alien to me that
yeah,
that my wife goes and gets her nails done. You think, but it's going to be services like people will
yeah,
cut your toenails. People, men will go there 3 or 4 times a month, etc. That because they've got that income. Whereas it's just changing, and I think the beauty of it is that should give hopefully more and better health care for people.
yeah,
Because I don't know about you, trying to get a dentist or doctor's appointment is uh, it's almost impossible. And you're thinking, if I talk to a robot and it tells me and gives me something to cure what illness I have, then great, because I'd rather do that than wait 6 weeks.
So do you think that in the franchise model, you think that we'll still be here offering the franchise system as a business?
I think we will, but I think it would be different.
Yeah.
I, th- I think
Yeah.
I think it would be different. I mean, we've got one of our USPs is price. We're very good on price and always have been, and I think that's becoming more of a norm. When I first started, 30 grand to franchise a business was norm. It was normally double or treble that.
Yeah.
And that there's companies out there that's not able to get away with that now.
So that would be a fee that I would pay you as a franchisee or franchisor.
So franchisor normally pays us a fee to get them into a franchise
Right.
position.
I
And then
get you. So I would come to you with my idea and say, listen, I'm a bit all over the show here. I just need some guidance. And you'd obviously give some guidance and assistance prior to charging. You wouldn't just go, I'm not going to speak to you unless you give me 5 grand.
I wish I could. No, it is, and also because we sell the franchise, we've got to have a relationship and feel
Yeah.
comfortable and confident with the people. And then so you can make mistakes. I mean, the biggest mistake we normally make is that we love the concept, we love the people, but they're just too busy.
Yeah.
And then they shouldn't franchise, but you don't know that until you're in that equation, etc. But so the franchisee pays the franchisor an upfront fee, and that upfront fee can sometimes be very blinding, and very, a number of times I've seen companies, and sometimes some of the big companies, that are just more interested in collecting franchise fees than building the brand.
And explain to me about the geography behind it. Can you have a number of franchise businesses in one area, or do you recommend that it's spread around?
It depends on the business. It's becoming more and more, franchises don't have a specified area. Uh, but normally you would have a protected area for the franchise if it was your window cleaning, because you don't want you don't want your own franchisees hitting each other.
So it would make sense on the window cleans. It's the power window cleano, that
Yeah,
cleano business I'm running very successfully, which I'm going to start franchising. You wouldn't want someone 2 miles away because that's a very manageable area, but you'd have no problem and you'd welcome someone doing it 100 miles away because it's sort of it makes sense that if you've got a brand that everyone starts to say, I mean, I think one of the best brands, only from my own personal treatment, is Specsavers. I find Specsavers to be one of the best companies I've ever dealt with in 30 years of dealing with. They're wonderful. I've never had a problem with them, and I'm specky, and I'm always losing glasses, and I'm always ordering glasses, always.
I, I,
And it
I,
makes sense
yeah,
to have lots of Specsavers around because of
yeah,
that. It makes sense to have lots of subways around. So it can work in your favor. But where
yeah.
you've got an industry whereby you've got to, like the cleaner business, it would only make sense if you've got a 50-mile radius because you wouldn't be driving anywhere other than 50 miles to do businesses.
I mean, again, I think 50 miles probably is a little bit too much for that type of business, only because I know that business a little
Yeah,
bit.
yeah,
Is that because one of the other things, and talking about all the technology and AI and the internet, but also what can be quite effective is that you see the van, you see the
yeah,
sign, you
yeah,
see
yeah,
the
yeah,
telephone number, and you think, my neighbour's having his windows done. Or you see it drives past you and you take the number, and
yeah, yeah,
that
yeah,
because that was out of its area, but there's someone there to take it over. So
yeah.
that is that.
It gets people's consciousness, doesn't it, around when
Yeah,
people see
yeah,
it. And that's why I'm a huge fan of trademarks. I'm a huge fan
yeah,
of,
yeah,
having the first one. I was quite proud. I've got a number of trademarks that I own personally and that Lawdit owns. And when I was working for a law firm in the 90s, and I came up with the idea for Lawdit, I immediately filed a trademark. And luckily I did because I got a text from a university lecturer who's sadly no longer with us to say, did you realize Price Waterhouse has launched Lawdit? And I hadn't even started yet, but I'd got the trademark. Now it turned out that it was a little bit um, um, misleading that they had launched it, but they had launched it in Australia. So I just sent them a text to say and they wrote back to say we have no plans of doing anything, and they withdrew their application in the UK. So I'm a massive fan. If I wouldn't have had a trademark, then I probably wouldn't have started my business and had the confidence. So it's
No,
like it's like a Lego. If you get the trademark and you're the only one that can use that brand,
mm,
if you don't have a trademark, other people can use that brand subject to the unregistered and passing off laws, but it's quite difficult to establish, especially if you've just
no,
started
I
now.
think it gives you credibility.
Yeah, it's perfect, And I do urge everybody, I always say to everybody, it's more important in some respects than, it's like leaving the house with your trousers on. Always get a trademark where you can.
It's,
Always.
I'm quite surprised, and I've been undone a couple of times where I've wrote something to them saying about trademark. They've been trading for 6 years, and then we're in that process, and then they haven't got a trademark.
Yeah.
And or without giving the company that they had an animal on their trademark
Yeah.
that they got off the internet.
Yeah. Yeah.
So someone out, and I'm saying so we then spent ages getting someone to redraw this animal and then re-registering the trademark, and then they had
Yeah.
a number of shops getting it redone, thinking,
Yeah. I can imagine.
it's just, and it's not a huge expense, but
No, it's not. It's 107. I mean, now the government charging 170. It's going up. I can't remember what it's going up to, but it's going up slightly in April, I think. But no, overall, if you use lawyers, you can get away with £400-500, but you can do it yourself. There's not rocket science to it. And if you've got an unusual brand, you can really do it yourself, because then the process of oppositions and dealing with the examiner can be relatively smooth. It's where there is confusion in the marketplace where you come up with something similar, then we get involved. But no, I do urge
there are
everybody to do
companies
it.
out there, that I've known that's looked at £2,000 or £3,000 coming back as a fee, and the franchise or the business is naive, and that's why I always turn around and say, look, we've got someone, you can do it yourself, but do it.
No, absolutely. I mean, we pretty much, I think for UK in one class, two classes, 750 altogether, including government fees.
Yeah.
And I think that's the top end. So no, but everybody should do it. And again, it's just a bit of a pride that you own that brand. Nobody else can own it, and put it in a certificate on the wall with a trademark holder of this. And it's very, very useful.
Yeah, I'm just looking at something now. Yeah.
All right. Well, look, I think I've got a 1 o'clock. I'm just looking at the time, which is it's cracking on. But
okay.
Thank you so much. And I've recorded this, and I'll make sure that it's sent out. And if you could do the same, that'd be great. And a happy New Year to you and Mrs. Hindmarsh, and thank you for your time, Rod. It's very good to speak to you again, and we'll keep in touch. We've known each other a long time. So any plans of retirement? Are you going to still crack on?
I think my grandson used to say, and it's something that's stuck with me, is when you retire, you're waiting for God.
Yeah. It's a long time. You're a long time sleeping. So I think I'm going to crack on till I'm 60 this year. So I'm going to carry on until I'm
only 21 in my mind anyway.
Of course. And with that tie on, you look about 25, anyway, Great to see you, Rod. Thank you. And I'll get this tidied up through Ryan, and we'll get it out to everybody. Thank you again for your time.
Much appreciated. You take care.
Bye.
Bye.